Hi everyone, thank you for being here. Today's guest is Richard Forer. He is a Jewish American author and an activist. He is the author of Wake Up and Reclaim Your Humanity, Essays on the Tragedy of Israel and Palestine, which was published in 2020. Now, this book won the New York City Big Book Award. He's also the author of Breakthrough Transforming Fear into Compassion, a new perspective on the Israel-Palestine conflict, which was published in 2010. He's also a former member of American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC. So welcome, Richard. Great to talk to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's good to be with you, Ali.
So how's your day been?
Pretty good. As I told you, I'm retired, so I don't have to be that busy. I am fairly busy, but not like I would be if I was working
Okay,
for a
okay.
living.
That's good. So what did you used to do?
There were two things. Number one, I was an independent insurance agent for many years, selling mostly health and life insurance. And I also became certified in the Meir Schneider self-healing method. I don't know if you ever heard of him. You
No.
may have heard about him. He was born blind and he healed himself as a teenager and began working with people with the worst diseases of mankind, not just eye diseases and common eye problems like nearsightedness and farsightedness, but also the most serious and rarest, in some cases, diseases of mankind. He is Israeli, and
Right.
he moved to the United States in 1974, I believe it was, where he opened the Center for Self Healing, and he's the only person in the world who is legally blind but can drive a car without any correction. He doesn't have to wear glasses.
Right.
He sees with his brain. His eyes are all scar tissue from unsuccessful experimental surgeries that were done when he was 4 or 5 years old that they now know could not ever possibly have worked. And so his better seeing eye only allows 5% of the light to penetrate to the retina that a normal eye allows. And so what he discovered was in healing his eyes, he discovered that he could work with pretty much anybody. And he's very famous for his work with muscular dystrophy. He's
Right.
the only person I know of who can slow down, stop, and even reverse the progress of muscular dystrophy. Anyway, as I said, he is Israeli. And I was good friends with him. But in 2006, when I had this spiritual awakening that basically converted me from a defender of Israel to a person who recognized my common humanity with all people, he got very upset with what happened to me. He was very upset with my change of heart, the fact that I was no longer pro-Israeli. And
Right.
I haven't spoken to him since 2006. I do want to mention I was pro-Israeli and I was a member of AIPAC. Now I am neither pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian. I am pro-humanity and
Yep.
I'm anti-oppression. So I don't want to say I'm pro-Palestinian because if I was pro-Palestinian and it was the Palestinians conducting a genocide
Yeah.
on the Israelis, well, then I'd be supporting it.
Yep.
So I'm not supporting the Palestinian cause because I like Palestinians, even though I do. I'm supporting them because they are being oppressed terribly by
Right.
a people who I used to identify with.
Right.
And I was part of the problem. Without my moral support and the moral support of millions like me, we're no different than a soldier in the field. Without our moral support, Israel could not get away with with its crimes against humanity and its war crimes.
So what made you change basically? And you say you were pro-Israel. So were you born in Israel or were you born in America?
I was born to a Jewish family in the United States in a fairly sizable community of Jewish people
Right.
between New York and Philadelphia.
Right.
So, I was born in the most populated area of Jewish people in the world outside of Israel.
Right.
And I had a lot of friends, both Jewish and non-Jewish, but mostly Jewish. My family attended Reform Synagogue. And I remember as a little kid, I identified strongly with being Jewish.
Yep.
And part of it was I was born just a few years after the Holocaust.
Right.
And I was fascinated that people could do such horrible things to other people. And I would occasionally see, they'd show it on TV, these documentary films about the survivors of Auschwitz and other concentration camps. So I would see these skeletal figures, the ones that were still alive, or I'd see skeletal corpses piled in piles all over the place. And also growing up and going to public school, where most of the kids in my school were not Jewish. In elementary school, I graduated elementary school in 1960, so I graduated just before the Supreme Court ruled that school prayer was illegal in the United States. So as a result of that, all through my public school career, our schools the teachers would have Easter and Christmas days in school, but they didn't have Hanukkah or Passover. And that felt very like an insult to me. I took that personally. And then I was exposed to some anti-Semitism, and all of this made me more identified with my Jewish culture, my Jewish society, with my Jewish identity.
Right.
And so I was very pro-Israel all my life. I justified everything Israel did. If people complained that Israeli soldiers had killed Palestinian children, I said what everybody said, and we didn't have to hear it from anybody or read it anywhere. I said, well, Hamas or the other terrorist groups are embedding their soldiers within civilian populations, and so then when Israel tries to shoot them, they may accidentally kill a child, and Hamas uses that to slander the Jewish people as child killers. None of that was true, okay? Or it was, if there is any truth to it, it's very minor, okay? All the human rights groups have pointed out that Hamas does not deliberately embed itself in civilian populations, nor does it use its own people as human shields, that it is Israel that very commonly and very cynically and cruelly uses people, even pregnant women, even little children, as human shields. So anyway, so what happened was on July 11th or July 12th, 2006, Hezbollah conducted a cross-border raid into northern Israel, and they killed, I think it was 3 Israeli soldiers and abducted 2. And that came just 3 weeks after Hamas had captured Gilad Shalit, the Israeli soldier on the Israel-Gaza border. And I saw this combination of events, which I'm pretty sure were not related, but I saw this combination of events as proof to me that I was right, that I was a victim. Not that I thought of myself as a victim, but what I mean is that the Arab world would not rest until Israel was wiped from the face of the earth. And that confirmed for me my Jewish identity as eternal victim. Okay, now I didn't have that consciously in my mind, that image of myself in my mind, but that is a common image within Jewish collective consciousness. And one of the things I discovered, which I'll explain how, one of the things I discovered is we always view the world and interpret events in a way that confirms who we think we are, that confirms how we identify ourselves. We filter everything through our identity. Let me just give you a real quick example, dramatic example of this. About 7-8 months ago, I was interviewed, and there were a lot of Zionists who were on the interview. And I had told the moderator, give the Zionists the first chance to ask questions during question and answer. So the way it worked was she introduced me, she mentioned the names of my 2 books, and then I spoke for 35 minutes. During my 35 minutes of speaking, I never mentioned either book one time, not one time. I also never referred to any historical event prior to 1948. And the first questioner, who was a Zionist, started off by saying, you promoted your book 49 times during your talk. The second guy, who was a Zionist, said, you just said you supported the Spanish Inquisition's torture of Jews. These are dramatic examples, but they're good examples because they show how the unexamined mind that unconsciously projects its suffering onto the other and then blames and scapegoats the other for its suffering is going to filter anything it can't handle and interpret it in a way that validates and preserves its sense of identity and the beliefs and images it holds that are cherished parts of their identity. So that's why I see, and I know that I think this is one of the reasons you wanted to talk to me. I see this issue not as a political, ideological, cultural, religious, or social issue or territorial issue. I see it as a psycho-spiritual issue. Psycho meaning our mind, how we scapegoat others, how we rationalize, how we deny, and what we deny, what we then project onto the other, what is actually true of ourselves, and spiritual in the sense that it's a matter of identity. Our identity and the beliefs and images that are part of that identity determine how we see and interpret the world. Ramana Maharshi was a great spiritual master from India. He came out of the Advaita Vedanta tradition, and he was considered the greatest sage of India of the 20th century, and maybe for all time. And there's millions of people who are familiar with him. And he used to say that the world is a projection. And I discovered that. I discovered that that the world simply is. We attribute to the world the content of our inner states of consciousness. And that is what is happening. So when you see the Israelis, and of course they're brought up, they really are brought up to see the world as anti-Semitic. They're brought up to see Palestinians and Arabs as lesser than. And often they're brought up to see them as subhuman. And you can see this. And what they're doing is they're projecting their hatred, their anger, their fear and confusion. They are projecting it onto, in this case, the Palestinian people, in particular in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. And then they are doing to the other what they think the other wants to do to them, what the Nazis did to them, what they would like to do to the Nazis. And it's very common for them to refer to Palestinians as Nazis. So this is really a serious problem, and it's not going to ever be solved unless people get to the root of it. And I'll just quickly give you my definition, which I consider a universal principle. The root cause of suffering is the attachment to a presumed, limited, and mortal identity and the beliefs and images that emanate from and reinforce that presumption. If someone were to take that principle and use it as a way to understand and interpret what is going on in the world, they would have a much better understanding. They would see why people lie so prolifically without even knowing that they're lying. Or they would see how people interpret events in such a bizarre way and then justify the most horrific things. And they do it all through the process of identity, through the means of preserving, validating, and aggrandizing their presumed selves.
Right. Thanks, Richard. You mentioned that Israelis are brought up to see Palestinians as subhuman. I mean, how does that happen? What stage does it start? I mean, what's the evidence for that?
Well, in schools, I know that in Israeli schools they talk about, and I think they even have graphics often, like over the blackboard, of Israel, of the Jewish people's enemies throughout history. Maybe they'll start off with the Philistines, the Egyptians, Assyrians, on and on and on, Arabs, and now the Palestinians. And so they're taught this way, and then the language that they use is the way I often explain it is, in the United States, most Jewish people I know who defend Israel, they don't know that they are bigots. They don't know that they are prejudiced against Palestinians, or that they even see Palestinians as not equal to Jews. They think they do. I did. I never thought that Palestinians were inferior to Jews. I just thought Palestinian culture was psychotic and anti-Semitic and predisposed towards violence, which was a projection. That's much more accurate to say about Israeli culture. But that's how I saw it. And so if someone would call me, well, let me put it this way. So in Israel, they're brought up, they don't see the Palestinians equal. They're taught that they're the Nazis, They're the Israel's enemies, like the aforementioned the Philistines and Egyptians, etc. And so, just like the Ku Klux Klan in the United States, their self-imagery, their perception of themselves does not depend on them seeing themselves as seeing all people as equal. Whereas in the United States, my Jewish friends and relatives, we all see all people as equal. It's just that some of these equal people hate Jews. They're anti-Semites and they're terrorists. So that's the justification. So whereas, like, for example, if you told a Ku Klux Klan man, you don't see people as equal, you're really biased, they would go, yeah, because white Christians are superior to Catholics, Jews, and black people. And it's the same in Israel. So that's why someone, for example, like Benny Morris, and this is just an example, but Benny Morris is the famous Israeli historian who wrote a number of books that revealed a lot of the atrocities and massacres that Israel conducted in 1948. And when Morris wrote those books, I think it was in the 80s, he didn't see that he was doing anything that would bring any negative publicity towards Israel. His reasoning was that, well, everybody does it. England did it, France did it, everybody does it. So Israel did it too. Israel cleansed the land, they killed people, they massacred and they raped. He didn't think people would make a big deal out of it, but they did. But Benny Morris, the reason he was an honest historian, but he also believes that Palestinians are, quote, serial killers and psychopaths, and that Israel should drop a nuclear bomb on Iran. So he doesn't have to pretend that he sees Palestinians as equal to Jews to protect and defend his self-imagery, okay? Whereas, Jewish people in the United States do have to make that pretense. Like, for example, Chuck Schumer is a big, strong defender of Israel, U.S. Senator, and he's Jewish. Well, he thinks he doesn't have any conception that he is acting with prejudice against Palestinians. He just thinks, as I thought, well, that Palestinians are terrorists. And the thing is, our identity, our attachment to this Jewish identity prevents us from really looking carefully at what is going on. So back to my story. So in my case, after Hezbollah conducted that cross-border raid, 3 weeks after Hamas captured Gilad Shalit, the very next day, Israel invaded Lebanon. And I supported it. But I was also distressed because, again, I saw the Arab world as wanting to destroy the Jews. I saw them as wanting to kill me just as much as they were killing any other Jew. And remember, this was during the Al-Qaeda and ISIS were still operating in 2006. I think ISIS was just getting started, actually, in Iraq. And so what happened was I went to a couple of friends of mine who were not Jewish, but my two wisest and probably most compassionate friends. And I knew they were critical of Israel. But I thought, well, this time, after what just happened, they're going to agree with me. And I wanted their agreement. So I went and spoke to them individually, and both of them did not agree with me. Both of them said that Israel was using disproportionate force in Lebanon and that Israel was the real aggressor. And so that demoralized me. So I went home and I started thinking a very common thought among Jewish people who are brought up with Israel as part of their identity. Maybe the world really is anti-Semites. Maybe even the best non-Jews just can't help it. Maybe it's just so ingrained that even the most compassionate Christians, the wisest and most compassionate, even they can't help but be anti-Semitic. Well, then what happened was something kind of unusual. An old Jewish friend I'd known all my life called me up on the phone. And this was like a week or so after I had spoken to my two Christian friends, non-Jewish friends. And so my friend called me up. I hadn't spoken to him in a while, and he never makes phone calls, which was why it was so unusual. But he called me up and said that he was going to be coming out west from New Jersey, where he lived, and he planned on visiting me. And I said, okay, that's great. And by the way, the Arab world wants to kill all the Jews. And I went on a 2-hour diatribe. And part of the reason I did was because I knew that he had actually studied the issue for many, many years. He had read books by many Israeli historians and sociologists, but he was very low key about it. He didn't really talk about it very much. And so I went on this diatribe, and he barely said a word. He let me speak. He never judged me. He never resisted me. Once in a while, he interjected something to correct something I had said, a historical point where he wasn't challenging my belief system. At the end of my diatribe, he goes, "Why don't you read a couple books? Why don't you read a book by, here's a couple Jewish Israeli authors that you might like, Baruch, Kimmerling, and Tanya, Reinhart." And when he said it, he didn't say it as a challenge. He just said it as a simple suggestion, non-judgmental. And then I thought to myself, maybe there's something I don't know about this issue. Now that's a ridiculous thing to say in a way, because I didn't know anything. I'd never studied. The only book I'd ever read was the debunked book From Time Immemorial by Joan Peters. That book had been debunked years ago, years before I had read it, and I didn't know it. And it made the case that there was no such thing as a Palestinian people, etc. And it's all been totally debunked, even by staunch Zionist scholars in Israel, who called it propaganda, a piece of trash.
Now, I would like to jump in here to dispel the myth that there was no Palestine or no such thing as Palestinians. The word Palestine has existed in one form or another since around 1200 BCE, more than 3,000 years ago. The sea people who settled in Canaan were referred to as the Palisad by the Egyptians in Egyptian inscriptions, most notably from the era of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu. Medinet Habu is an ancient Egyptian temple complex located on the west bank of the Nile River. Canaan historically included areas of modern-day occupied Palestine, Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Western Jordan, and southwestern Syria. Over time, that region became known as Philistia, or Land of the Philistines. The Greek historian Herodotus referred to the region where the Palisad had settled as Syria-Palestine in 440 BCE. Later, the influential geographer Claudius Ptolemy included Palestina in a map in his work Geographia around 150 CE, which became one of the most important geographical texts of the ancient world. He described Palestina as part of the Roman province Syria-Palestina. Numerous historical maps since then have clearly shown Palestine, including key cities like Gaza and Jerusalem. For example, a 1698 Latin map, based on Gerard Mercator's edition of Ptolemy's Geographia, labels the region as Palestina. Here is another 1878 map of Syria and Palestina by Keith Johnston. There are many more ancient maps showing Palestine. None of the maps before 1948 show any Israel. They all show Palestine. Now, under Islamic rule, Palestine was known as Jund Filistin. It was an administrative province from around 630 CE until the Crusader period in 1099 CE. In more recent times, in 1890, Cambridge scholar Guy Lee Strange published Palestine under the Muslims, a description of Syria and the Holy Land from AD 650 to 1500. It documented towns, regions, people, and administration of Palestine and Greater Syria from AD 650 to 1500 during the Islamic era. In 1911, two Orthodox Christians launched the Arabic newspaper Palestine in Jaffa, a major city of Palestine. During the British Mandate 1917 to 1948, the region was officially named Palestine, and passports, stamps, and currency all bore that name of Palestine. The Palestinian people have had a distinct historical, cultural, and geographic identity long before the establishment of Israel in 1948, which involved the ethnic cleansing and displacement of hundreds of thousands of native Palestinians. When the Palestinians were Jewish and fighting against the Roman Empire by throwing rocks at them, they did not surrender then. So there is no reason to believe they will surrender to Israel now just because they converted to Christianity and Islam.
So that was the only book I read. So when my friend said, "Why don't you read, a couple books, Baruch, Kimmerling, and Tanya Reinhart?" I said, "Well, yeah, maybe I should do that," because I was in such distress. I thought maybe it would alleviate some of my confusion, although I didn't really know I was confused. I was interpreting it as anxiety. So when we hung up, I compiled a list of books. I went to Amazon, looked up Kimmerling and Reinhart, and compiled a list of books by Jewish authors only, I knew that I could not trust any non-Jewish author. I then drove over to my library and looked for some of these books. And I found a book by Baruch Kimmerling, and I didn't find anything by Tanya Reinhart. But then I saw this book called Beyond Chutzpah, on the misuse and abuse of anti-Semitism, something like that, by Norman Finkelstein, a name I did not recognize, but I knew it was a Jewish name. So I opened the book and I looked at the book jacket, and the book jacket said that this book, Beyond Chutzpah, was a takedown of Alan Dershowitz. And Alan Dershowitz was the famous Harvard lawyer. And I always liked, up until that point, I always liked Alan Dershowitz. And I enjoyed seeing him on TV, and I liked his legal analysis on various issues. And he was a liberal Jew, like me. So I thought, oh, wow, this challenges Alan Dershowitz? Oh, my God. Then it said that Norman Finkelstein was, I think, the first person to disprove the writings of Joan Peters from time immemorial, that he had done his doctoral thesis at Princeton and that he had completely debunked that book by Joan Peters. And I thought, oh my God, because Joan Peters' book was my Bible. Every time someone criticized Israel, I could cite something from her book that would challenge their criticism. So I said, oh my God. So I had this dilemma. Oh my God, I don't really want to read this, but it'll always be in the back of my mind, so I got to take this book out. So then I went home and I started reading a little bit. And nothing much was happening for a few days. Then I decided to pick up Beyond Chutzpah by Finkelstein. And I started reading it. And now remember, my commitment to myself, I actually told myself I was not going to allow any preconceived ideas to influence my research. I was going to do my research without any objective at all other than to find the truth, and I was not going to be biased in any direction. That was a commitment I made to myself. So I'm reading Finkelstein, and he's criticizing Israeli policy and Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, page after page. And the thing was, when I first started reading him, I knew that he was brilliant. And that kept me going, because there might have been a tendency, oh, I'm sick of this. He's so one-sided. I'm sick of this. But I kept reading, and as I was reading, he was documenting everything he was saying. He had a lot of footnotes. He was citing Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization. Yep. And so I'm reading this, and he's citing these organizations, and when he cites them, and all the citations are critical of Israel, I would go online and find the document he is using for his citation, as a source. And I would read what he had been reading. And I was hoping to catch him taking something out of context or even changing some of the language in order to slander Israel and make the Palestinians look real innocent. But everything he did was meticulous and accurate. So I just kept reading. And then what happened at a certain point, I'd read about how I'd read all these things that I never knew were the case. How Israel uses collective punishment, how they'll demolish homes, and when they demolish homes, sometimes if people can't get out of the home, like a paraplegic, someone in a wheelchair, an old person, they don't care, they'll demolish the home anyway. How Israeli soldiers use lethal force against civilians, even when there's no weapons present among the civilians. How Israel takes the water from Palestinian villages for its settlements. A lot of really negative things. And I'm reading this, and as I was reading this, I was so absorbed in what I was reading that I didn't resist any of the emotions that came over me. They just happened spontaneously and organically as I was reading. So at first I went through shock at what I was reading, at what Israel was doing to these people. And then the shock turned to anger at Israel for doing it to these people in my name as a Jew. And then the anger turned inwards against myself for being so gullible all my life and for believing all this. For believing that Israel was always so innocent and treated everybody so fairly. And because that was part of my belief. I always believed no Israeli soldiers, they treat everybody respectfully. So, and then the anger at myself, then it turned into embarrassment and shame at myself for just believing what I wanted to believe all my life and never conducting any research to find out if what I believed was true. Basically, just believing what I wanted to believe. And then I felt this sorrow for the suffering of the Palestinians. So at that point, I put the book down. I needed a break. And I closed my eyes. And I don't know how long my eyes were closed. But when I opened them, I felt cleansed and totally free. And the contrast between the moment before I closed my eyes and all those emotions I was going through and the moment when I opened my eyes was so dramatic that I spontaneously started looking around my room. I was looking in the corners of the room and in my bookshelves. Where's the anger? Where's the shame? Where's the shock? And I couldn't find any of it. And then I realized I was in this state of bliss and freedom. So I just relaxed. I sat back in my chair and just relaxed. I had no interest in doing anything. And I was not drawn towards the future. I was not drawn to the past. I was just, as I would put it, I was simply present. And then all of a sudden I felt this incredible warmth rise up inside my body. And I recognized this was peace. And then I saw that peace was reflected outside of me and that the world is a reflection of our inner states of consciousness, that the world and me are an interaction. We're not separate from each other. And then then I felt this cloth across my face, across my eyes, with a gentle pressure against my eyes, and it felt good. And then all of a sudden, the cloth started unraveling. And as it unraveled, it allowed me to see, and I felt totally blissful. And then a variety of things happened, but then I decided I wanted to find out. I realized I was free in that moment, that I was not burdened by my racial history, my personal history, my psychological history, whatever you want to call it. I was free. So I wanted to see if I really was free, if I was really free of the fear that had motivated me prior to this experience. So I imagined myself, I decided to do a test on myself. I imagined myself in the place of Nick Berg. Nick Berg was the 20-something-year-old employee working in Iraq in 2003 who was captured by, I think it was Al-Qaeda of Iraq at the time. And he was captured by them, and he was on TV, and I couldn't watch it. I don't think they showed the graphic part, but they beheaded him with a knife. That English Muslim guy, I forget his name, he beheaded him. And I wanted to see if I could put myself in Nick Berg's place and how I would feel. Would the horror arise that always used to arise whenever I would read about these horrible events against Jews mostly? Well, not just Jews, but when it was against a Jew, I saw myself in the place of that Jew. So I imagined myself in the place of Nick Berg. I also imagined myself being present as Arab terrorists were slaughtering children. And no pain, no trauma, no anger, no fear arose. Instead, what arose to me was the realization that no matter how horrendous the behavior of these people, even the world's worst terrorists, crave the same right to self-determination as do I. And when that realization happened, I recaptured the humanity I didn't know I had forfeited in my prejudices, the prejudices I didn't know I had towards the Arab world. And then another physical experience happened where my body from the toes up was filled with bliss and what I call equanimity. And I could no longer find a Jewish identity. And in fact, that's what it was, looking for a Jewish identity when I put myself in the place of Nick Berg. The details, the chronology is not that important. But what happened was, in that instant, I realized And it wasn't a thought. It wasn't an intellectual deduction. I realized we are all Palestinians and Israelis, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Africans, Europeans, Chinese. We are all one people. And the Jewish identity or any limited identity is simply a mental construct. It is not necessary. It obstructs us and distracts our attention from our true nature, which is free of identity, free of separation, free of bigotry and prejudice, and sees all things as part of one family. And then I noticed that I felt like I had awakened from a dream, literally, that all my life I had been dreaming. And now I was awake from the dream. It was so clear. It was such a dramatic feeling that I actually physically pinched myself to see if I was actually not dreaming. And then I realized that my story, Richard Foer, was simply the main character in a play that I was making up as I went along. We're all characters in our own fictional story, and we're making up the story as we go along. So in this moment, I knew that what I had discovered was so powerful. And then what happened was more insights came, and I realized that I had been, and the world is, the natural human condition as separate selves, when we see ourselves as separate, which everybody does, except for a rare few spiritual masters, that the separate self is its primary disposition is existential fear and confusion. Confusion always accompanies existent fear because fear is the lens through which we see the world. So it colors what we see. It colors how we see the world, how we interpret the world, and that creates confusion. And in my case, the existential fear and confusion had been transformed into compassion and clarity because I now saw the world from a 360-degree perspective. And so along with compassion, which is seeing the world in that perspective, along with compassion, clarity arises. And so I decided, okay, I have been wrong all along. I've been projecting what was true of me onto the so-called other. Now I need to share this with the world because I don't know of anyone else that has come up with these insights. And so I decided to write a book. And that's when I spent 4 years writing the first book, spending sometimes 12, 14 hours a day studying material. I studied voluminous amounts of material, mostly from Israeli sources that had access to Israeli archives, like the Book of the Haganah, published by the Israeli Military Press, or the writings of prime ministers and chiefs of staff and the ministries of foreign affairs and internal security, Shin Bet and Mossad. And I was very, very picky and meticulous. And the reason I was because I figured that my Jewish friends and relatives and my identical twin brother is a Orthodox Jew who lived in Israel, still has children in Israel, and he's to the right of Ariel. He was to the right of Ariel Sharon. That's how right-wing he is. So I knew that if I'm going to convince anybody that everything they've believed all their lives is inaccurate, I've got to be as meticulous and fastidious as possible. I need to be so fastidious that even my identical twin brother will not be able to argue with me when he reads this material. And it wasn't that I was writing in order to slander Israel. I was writing to clarify all the major arguments. I was writing to show how Israel, I discovered this as I was studying, but I discovered, for example, that Israel has never really wanted to make peace. It has always used peace as a diversion. And they even said so. Even Israeli doves said so, that they were just fooling the world into thinking they wanted to make peace. I wanted to show that Israel, I didn't want to show, but I found out that from the very beginning, Israel has always deliberately, knowingly, premeditatedly targeted civilians. And then I got into some of the major arguments like the UN partition plan and the 2000 Camp David summit at the end of Bill Clinton's term, that allegedly the Palestinians rejected a generous offer from Ehud Barak. I looked into all of that thoroughly, reading the writings of the participants. And everything I discovered proves that every argument I had ever made, and this is not an exaggeration, every single argument I or anyone I know ever made in defense of Israel was either factually inaccurate, or if there was some truth to it, taken out of context for the express purpose of exonerating the Israelis unjustifiably and maligning the Palestinians unjustifiably. I guess I've talked for quite a while. I better let you say something.
No, that's okay. It's fascinating to listen to your story. There's so much information in there. So when you say it was first time for you to understand the Palestinian side, or what actually was going on when you read Norman Finkelstein's book, is it because people in Israel or people in America, they don't hear what's going on in Palestine and in the other neighboring countries? How does that happen? Because we are so connected right now. Even in 2000, we were so connected. I mean, surely news would come to America, news would come to Israel that these atrocities are happening.
Yes, but they rationalize them. Okay. Well, number one, pre-awakening, I would always, when Israel would kill a child, when Israeli soldiers would kill a child or two or three, I would say, well, I mourn for the Palestinians, but Israel had to defend itself. But that was bullshit. That was a lie. I didn't mourn. Okay. I was just saying that to convince myself that I was still fair and humane, because that was part of my identity. Those qualities were very important parts of my identity. So I would justify the killing of children by Israelis. The truth was, and I would hear the same thing from Israeli spokespeople, and I know they didn't mean it. They could care less. But the death of one Jew anywhere in the world was far more dreadful to me than the death of 1,000 Arabs anywhere in the world, including Palestinians at the hands of Israelis, because I could see myself in the place of the Jew. So what happens is, as I said earlier, we filter everything through the lens of our identity. If we see ourselves as fair and humane, then, and I bet you that even Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, and Smotrich see themselves as fair and humane. They may say that Jews are superior to Palestinians. They may even say, and I'm sure they do, that Palestinians are cockroaches, they're Nazis, they're terrorists. But their justification is, well, that's because they are. That's because they are. So, as I say, so we see everything through the lens of our identity. Everything we see cannot challenge our identity. Anything that does challenge our identity, and I'm a great challenge to people's identity. The greatest threat to Jewish supporters of Israel is a fellow Jew who used to think like them, who has seen the light and now understands their thought processes that they do not understand, nor do they want to understand. They want to remain as unconscious as possible. So being conscious is a huge threat to them. So what happens is they will rationalize everything, even the murder of children. Now, I've heard some people say that, well, it's the photos and the films of all these suffering Palestinians, it's AI generated. I've heard people say that. But mostly they don't really pay attention. They read, I still get AIPAC's newsletters. And in the last few months, they've been sending it every day. And they just repeat the Israeli line. Like, for example, recently, those 4 reporters were killed at the hospital. AIPAC just printed, well, they were all members of Hamas. Didn't give any evidence. They were all members of Hamas. And then every day, almost, AIPAC will print, today, Israel delivered 2.5 million meals to the Gazans. Stuff like that. They're repeating the lies of Netanyahu. I don't know of a single human rights organization, and there's so many, but I don't know of one that agrees with what Israel's saying. They are all saying these people are starving, it is a famine, and they're not getting food into Gaza. And not only that, it looks to me like Israel is using the delivery of food like the Nazis used the delivery of food to the Warsaw Ghetto to lure people out so they can kill them or do something else, transport them somewhere else. But anyway, my point is that we human beings can justify anything. Okay? Now, again, if you see the Palestinians as Nazis, which is a very common image, and I'm sure you heard on October 7th, after Hamas's attack, you must have heard rabbis, political leaders, including the highest military leaders, say we have to kill, they're all Hamas. We have to kill every one of them. I heard one rabbi say we have to kill every Gazan over the age of 3. Okay? And they really believe this. And the Orthodox Jews will say it's justifiable through halakha. Halakha is the Jewish equivalent to Sharia, Jewish law. Okay? So they'll also use halakha to justify it. Or it's God's will. You'll hear this from Christians also, it's God's will. They're vermin. They use the same language or similar language as the Nazis used when referring to Jews and gypsies and, gay people and disabled people. So you can rationalize anything. They're always telling themselves a story. They're always making things up in their mind and then believing it. And they do that, like, for example, I've had a dialogue. Well, let me give you a graphic example. On June 1st of this year, a man Egyptian American by the name of Mohammed Solomon firebombed a walk in Boulder, Colorado. One woman eventually died. A couple people had some, I guess, fairly minor injuries. I think the woman who died and maybe one other person were hospitalized. Well, I live a few miles from Boulder, Colorado. I know some of the people who are part of the marchers that march every Sunday, waving the Israeli flag, singing Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem, and flaunting Israel and calling for the release of ceasefire, calling for the release of hostages, not for a ceasefire. Okay, I've been involved in this issue for almost 20 years, and I still am astonished at the level of unconsciousness and inhumanity that comes from people who support Israel. So, for example, I've spoken to a couple. They insist, as do all the newspapers, the reporters who are basically, just repeating the Israeli AIPAC line, that Mohammed Solomon, the reason he firebombed this walk was because he was anti-Semitic. Okay? Now, the thing is, he told the FBI he had nothing against the Jewish community and that he was angry at what Israel was doing to my people, his people. So I've said to some of these marchers, I've said, don't you think that maybe it wasn't out of anti-Semitism, maybe he was just so enraged that he committed a horrible act out of anger at what Israel was doing to the Palestinian people who he identified with. And they said, absolutely not. He's an anti-Semite. So then I would say something like, well, not something like, I would say, well, if the reason he firebombed the march was because he's an anti-Semite, then I guess if it was another country other than Israel, a non-Jewish country that was slaughtering and maiming hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, I guess he wouldn't have done anything. And of course, they don't even answer that. And then I say something like, everybody, we all have a moral responsibility to the world. For instance, my moral support for Israel 20 years ago and the moral support of millions like me made it possible for Israel to be able to carry out its policies. And without your moral support and the moral support of millions like you, maybe someone like Mohammed Solomon would not have done what he did. And they reject that as ridiculous. They do not think that there's any interconnectedness in the world at all. No, we are totally innocent. We have done absolutely nothing wrong. We have done nothing that could possibly be construed as contributing to violence or suffering in the world, or to Israel's treatment, or to any possible treatment Israel might occasionally do that is inhumane. And these are people. A lot of these people are wealthy, retired. They contribute to AIPAC. They give money to AIPAC. They support politicians who take money from AIPAC and do whatever Israel wants them to do. They write letters to the editor and guest opinions claiming that Israel is innocent and that we protesters are a bunch of anti-Semites. And yet they can't even conceive of the possibility that they play a role in the suffering in the world. As I say, this is a battle between consciousness and unconsciousness, and in their case, unconsciousness is their goal, and unconsciousness is winning, and they are going to destroy the world if they continue this way and continue supporting Israel like this. People need to wake up.
So the way they rationalize all this is basically they are right, the other side is wrong. So that becomes a very simple argument in their mind, I guess. So they can justify many
Absolutely.
things. But is it because anti-Semite, I mean, that's a term, I think means different things to different people, because as I understand, Semites were the people who lived in the Semite region and spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. So these three people
Right.
were from the Semite group, Abrahamic,
Right. Well,
yeah.
Ali,
Yeah.
when they use the term anti-Semitism, they're strictly referring to hatred of Jews for non-Jews. Well,
Yeah.
that's the traditional definition of anti-Semitism.
Yeah,
Now
in their mind, I guess. Yeah, if you
Yes.
look at the broader anti-Semitism, definition, people who belong to Semites, who belong to the Semite region,
Right.
if you discriminate against them, that becomes anti-Semitism.
Right.
But I
So
guess,
I would
Yeah.
rather use the term Jew hatred.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
and that's what they mean. But it's very interesting because they have changed the definition. Now some Jews are deciding that other Jews are anti-Semites or Jew haters because they support the Palestinian equality. I've had people tell me, literally. So, for example, I was at a rally and I was holding a sign that said "Free Palestine," and this one Jewish man who I know just from being at these events, who's quite a hateful human being, accused me of promoting anti-Semitism. And I said, what, you think holding a sign that says Free Palestine promotes anti-Semitism? And he goes, yes. I said, well, what about Israel killing tens of thousands of people in the name of the Jewish people? Does that incite anti-Semitism? And he goes, no. So let me give you an example of what these people do. First of all, it's moral blackmail. What they're doing is, again, it's all about self-imagery. Rather than look within, first of all, they'd rather send their children to war than inquire within, than challenge their identities. They really would. But rather than take responsibility for their feelings of fear, confusion, anger, and their beliefs that they've never inquired into, they project all of that onto us, onto Palestinians, and onto people like us who support the Palestinian cause, including Jews who support the Palestinian cause, and they make us the ones who have their qualities. They make us into the bigots. Where is the bigotry? So what they do is, and this is really amazing, this is how confused they are. If you believe in documented history that has been cross-checked for decades by numerous Jewish historians, if you believe in documented history, you're an anti-Semite. So they don't know the history. They don't want to know the history because of how what it would suggest about themselves. So if you believe the history, you're an anti-Semite. If you believe in international law, you're an anti-Semite because international law is anti-Semitic. The reason it's anti-Semitic is because it says that what Jews are doing, what Israelis are doing in the name of Jews is illegal, and they consider that anti-Semitic. And if you have compassion for Palestinians, you're anti-Semitic because they are callously indifferent to the suffering of the Palestinians. They have to be in order to maintain that self-imagery or identity. So basically, their proof that you're not an anti-Semite is you don't believe in international law, you don't believe in documented history, and you are callously indifferent to the Palestinian people. Now, those qualities normally would make people see Jews as inhumane and unfair. But that that seeing of Jews as unfair and inhumane, that too would be called anti-Semitic, which means that according to these people who support Israel and always use the term anti-Semitic, the proof that you're not an anti-Semite proves that you are an anti-Semite. I mean, their reasoning is so ridiculous, and it's all because they refuse to take a moment and look at the history. And by the way, Ali, they've never seen Israel. They don't know Israel. They don't care about Israel. They're not defending Israel. What they see, care, and defend are images of Israel in their own minds that comport with how they see themselves. They then project these images of themselves onto Israel, and that's what they see. They never see the real Israel. The real Israel would horrify them. That's why they can't see it. And that's why I say this is a psycho-spiritual problem.
Yeah, it does seem that way. But again, I think probably it's the upbringing as well, and living in
Yes.
fear that what happened during the Holocaust
It's the conditioning.
could happen again. But I mean, do they know about other people's history? Let's say, for example, I come from Pakistan, so India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. According to one of the reports by Western scholars, 165 million of us were killed by British colonialism in just 40 years, 1890 to 1930. In 40 years, 165 million, that figure is coming from the Western scholars. Our figures, our historians have different figure, which is much more conservative. But again, atrocities have been happening throughout the history of the world. Do people understand different people have suffered also? Leopold killed around 13 million in Africa as well. I mean, do they sympathize with those atrocities?
Yes, yes, as long as they don't implicate Israel. So, for example,
Right.
many Jewish people my age and somewhat younger and older were protesters against the Vietnam War. Okay, because that didn't involve, it didn't involve Jews. So a lot of the people who support Israel today are liberal Jews, but when it comes to Israel and Palestine, they are on the side of the far, far, far right. But again, they rationalize it all because they're brought up, they've never questioned their beliefs. You see, that's a problem. People rarely question their beliefs. For example, I have said to a couple of these Jewish people that I know, I've said, look, if you were switched at birth and raised by a Muslim family in Mecca, I don't think you would have the same views that you have now. I don't think that you would be supporting Israel now. And they can't even understand that. Their mind is blinded. It's as if they become unconscious and they cannot think clearly. They cannot think clearly because reality is setting in. And the confusion that always accompanies the fear of losing your identity, is just too much for them to bear. So that's why they're so irrational. I'm telling you, identity, everybody is attached to various extents, but the attachment to a presumed, limited, and mortal identity and the beliefs and images that emanate from and reinforce that presumption, that is the root cause of suffering. And I emphasize the word mortal because they see it, their unconscious minds, they're too unconscious to realize this, but their unconscious minds, when I challenge them, like one of the big arguments in the Jewish community is, well, the Jewish side accepted the 1947 United Nations partition plan and the Palestinian side rejected it, so there. So when I share with them the actual facts, that the Jewish side never wanted partition, but it only accepted it because it intended to, quote David Ben-Gurion, expand into the whole of Palestine, and that the Jewish side rejected an Arab peace plan for one democratic state, and there's so much more that I could say about that, but they don't hear it. They only want to cling to their little sound bites, okay? And I forget where I was going with this, but my point is that any challenges to their identity Any challenges to their precious belief system are taken as mortal threats. Mortal threats. This is really why, really, they would rather send their children to war than question their identity. And this
Right.
is not a Jewish problem. It's a universal problem, but it's just that the Israel-Palestine issue is so exaggerated coming from the Israeli side that I call it an archetype for suffering.
Yeah. I mean, it's in a way, if people can sympathize with the suffering of the other group, that sort of alleviates the problem. But yeah, again, if you got blinders on, if you live in your own echo chambers, it becomes really difficult to sympathize with the other group.
Right. I mean, can you imagine? I'm sure you've seen videos of Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich and Netanyahu. Can you imagine them ever acknowledging anything humane? I'm going off track a little bit, but I detested Netanyahu even in the 90s. I detested him his whole career, even when I was still a big supporter of Israel. I would get nauseous looking at him, physically nauseous, but I thought he was an aberration. I didn't think he really represented Israel. Okay.
Yeah.
Now you got him, teamed up with Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. How can anybody not see the Jewish supremacist, ideology amongst them? And because I never would have. If I had not had this spiritual awakening, I'm sure, at least by the time Netanyahu teamed up with Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, I would have seen the light. Because I know that those other guys are avowed Jewish supremacists, and that never would have that was something I couldn't avoid. That would have been something I couldn't rationalize, and I would have seen the light. I would not have supported this genocide. So the people who still do support Israel in the midst of all of this, almost 2 years of blatant genocide, which Israel has said it was going to do. They all said this is what they were going to do. They didn't use the word genocide, but they all said they were going to do what they're doing. If these people are still supporting Israel after all this time, it tells you how deeply entrenched their identities are in their minds, in their unconscious, subconscious, and conscious minds. They cannot tolerate anything that suggests that they are on the side of inhumanity.
Right. So what role does AIPAC play in this? And what actually is AIPAC? You mentioned that you were a former member of AIPAC. I mean, are you able to tell something about that?
Well, AIPAC was started in the 1950s. I think you said public affairs. I used to say public affairs. I think it's American Israel Political Affairs Committee. But anyway, they are the most powerful lobby in the United States. They represent the interests of Israel. When I was a member of AIPAC, they told me, well, we just do what Israel tells us to do. And they do. I can see that from their emails I still get. They have enormous influence in Congress. I think out of 535 congressmen, there's less than 15 who do not accept money from AIPAC. My congressman is Joe Neguse. He is an African American, and he is a big recipient of AIPAC funds and a strong supporter of Israel. Nothing can sway him. I've written many letters to him. I doubt he reads them, but I always say, you being an African American, I would think you'd be more sensitive to apartheid-like policies than most people. And yet, if this was 1964, I'll bet you would have voted against the Civil Rights Bill. And because he's just, and again, he's another example. He's not Jewish. He doesn't have an emotional stake like a lot of Jews do. But he has to convince himself that Israel is not committing genocide and that it's only defending itself. How else could he accept money in return for supporting the slaughter of babies and infants and the intentional starvation of people? How else could he support that? But this is a very common problem within the human condition, how people can so easily lose their humanity in defending or in believing in their presumed limited and mortal identities.
So what do AIPAC members do? I mean, did you have to do anything special being an AIPAC member?
No, most
Just
AIPAC
donate.
members.
Okay.
Yeah, we just
Right.
donate. They have hundreds of millions of dollars. They probably have over a billion. But
Right.
AIPAC itself has many, many lobbyists. They have more lobbyists who lobby Congress than there are congressmen.
Wow.
And I'll
Wow.
bet you anything. I can't prove this, but when I write a letter to my congressman, I always get a letter back within a second. So obviously it's a form letter. And I'll bet you anything when it comes to Israel Palestine, it's written by AIPAC.
Hmm.
And they also have Israel has Hasbara propaganda agents on college campuses. Often, when I've given speeches, there are people in the audience who are, I can tell, I usually can pick them out after they start talking, who are Hasbara agents. They have a certain style and they never know what they're talking about, but they don't really need to because most people in the audience don't know the history that well. You know, I'll give you a little example. Alan Dershowitz is Israel's lawyer, or has been Israel's lawyer, and he wrote a ridiculous book that Norman Finkelstein debunked, which anybody can debunk
Yeah.
themselves if they
Yeah.
wanted to. And I read that book as part of my research. Anyway, Alan Dershowitz is a very smart man, right? But for whatever reason, he is totally incapable of seeing anything from any point of view other than Israel is only protecting itself. So about a year or so ago, during this genocide, I saw him on YouTube with Cornel West. They've been on YouTube together before. I once saw a debate between them on Israel. And Dershowitz, the audience voted Dershowitz the winner. And the reason the audience voted Dershowitz the winner is because Cornel West is not that knowledgeable about the history. So he wasn't able to debunk the lies and the false stories, the Hasbara, that Dershowitz was citing. And the audience didn't know enough of the history to know that most of what Dershowitz was saying had already been debunked, historically debunked. So in this video of Cornell and Dershowitz, Dershowitz says this is like, I don't know, maybe 6 to 8 months into the genocide in Gaza. So you hear Dershowitz tell Cornell, Israel doesn't target children. Israel does not target children. And Cornell's always coming from a humanitarian place, which I like, except that he doesn't know the history well enough to prove Dershowitz wrong. And he goes, Israel's never targets children. Israel never targets children. And Dershowitz goes, no, Israel has never targeted children, not once in its entire history. Well, Dershowitz's book, The Case for Israel, the one that Norman Finkelstein destroyed in Norman Finkelstein's book, Beyond Chutzpah, that book, Dershowitz's main source in that book is Benny Morris, who he cites 87 times. 59 of those 87 times that Dershowitz cites Benny Morris are from Benny Morris's book, Righteous Victims. Righteous Victims details, I think, 22 massacres by the Israelis in 1948 against Palestinian villages. And yet Dershowitz is saying that and these massacres included lining people up and shooting them in the head, raping women, beating people over the head with sticks until they die, throwing them in a common ditch. And Dershowitz says that Israel has never once targeted children. So this is how the mind works.
Yeah.
The mind is so creative, it will do anything to protect its identity.
That's true. And also, I think Finkelstein mentioned that Dershowitz may have plagiarized some of the passages as well. But surely it's documented history that I was reading Avi Shalim's book, The Three Memoirs, and he's an Arab Jew, lives in the UK now. He was saying that in 1950s in his book, so when the Israel was created in 1948, now they had to legitimize the creation of Israel. Said they wanted Jews to move to Israel to give it some sort of legitimacy. So they started bombing Jewish institutions in Iraq also, which made most of the Jews move to Israel, because if they had stayed in Iraq, they would have been killed by Israeli terrorists.
Right.
So
Well, Israel
that's all
made
documented history, and that's just
yes.
one section of the history. There have been many cases where terrorism has been carried out against Arab Jews by Israeli terrorists to make
False
them move
flag
to
attacks.
Israel. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. What Israel did was they made it seem as if the bombings in like Baghdad, as if the bombings were committed by Iraqis, by Arabs.
But they've been living peacefully for centuries. They had never been an issue. There was an Arab culture, and Arab culture involved Muslims, Christians, Jews. So religion was an identity, but it wasn't the identity. The identity was the region, the Arab culture, I guess.
I think
Yeah.
you're right. Well, but let me add to that. There's a couple things. Number one, Karen Armstrong is a. Do you know who she is? She's a
Yeah.
retired Catholic
Yeah.
nun. She's written a
Yeah.
number of books. They've had PBS specials on her. She
Yeah.
pointed out, and this was not in the context of the Israel-Palestine issue, but she pointed out that for 2,500 years, Jews and non-Jews lived fairly peacefully within the Arab world, and that it wasn't until around 1948 that the Arab world, started reacting to Jews, and they didn't even have their own anti-Semitic tropes. So they had to borrow for example, the Arab world borrowed the protocols of the elders of Zion from Russia, okay, as part of their campaign of demeaning Jews, okay, but the point was that they didn't even have these anti-Semitic tropes that the Christian world has had for 2,000 years. Yeah, and Israel, the painful part of it, even the obscene part of it, is that Israel likes anti-Semitism because it proves that Jews are victims of it proves that Jews are victims, that the world hates Jews, therefore the Jews should move to Israel. And so it's like a cycle. It's like a mechanism a thought mechanism where if you criticize Israel, you're anti-Semitic. So yeah, of course we have to have a Jewish state. So the Jewish state, it's unbelievable. They cannot put themselves in the shoes of the other person. So the Jewish state carries out atrocities for years on Palestinian villages, and then when a small number, percentage-wise, a small number of Palestinians revolt and use violence, it just proves that Israel has to defend itself because these are bloodthirsty terrorists. It never occurs to them that there's a reason for everything. And if they
Yeah.
would look at their own history, they would find the reason.
No, it's the same thing that happened in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh under
Right.
British colonialism. When people started revolting, they were termed terrorism was not a term that was used back then, but in 1990, the term that was used was anarchist and thugs and rebels. So there were legal laws passed against anarchists who would rebel against the colonialism. But yeah, again, we had to make sacrifices to win our freedom.
And by the way,
It's yeah, it's just human nature to resist the occupation. Yeah.
and I can't remember who I was reading. Someone who did a study of terrorism said that he never met a terrorist who wanted to be a terrorist. They were all people whose lives had been disrupted, whose families had been destroyed, who were simply, in their minds, defending their people. And I want to point out, Hamas is a resistance group. Yes, they do some bad things, but they were formed as a resistance group. And over the years, they were formed in 1987, but from 1988 up until probably, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, they had made at least well over a dozen attempts to make peace with Israel. These attempts were confirmed by as legitimate, as honest attempts to make peace by Jimmy Carter, the Strategic Studies Institute at the U.S. Army War College, Ephraim Halevi, former Mossad chief and chief of national security for Israel, Yuval Diskin, I think he's a former Mossad chief, the New York Times, and many other sources. Israel never once responded to any of these. And here's the thing, Hamas is a resistance group just like the IRA was a resistance group against the British, the Mau Mau's against the British, the National Liberation Front in Algeria against the French. The Irgun, the Stern Gang, and the Haganah were terrorist groups. They pioneered bombs in the marketplace, bus bombs, drive-by shootings. But the difference is the Jewish terrorist groups were not the indigenous people defending their country against an unwanted occupier. They were the unwanted occupier trying to expel the indigenous people. So they can't, so this is why I say there is no fair argument anyone can make in defense of Israel. They can make the argument, yes, the Jews would like peace. Some Jews would. They can make an argument kind of like that, but then they have to side. If they really believe that, then they have to side with international law and acknowledge that Israel is committing genocide, that Israel has rejected every peace plan put in front of it since 1948, and that Israel really wants a greater Israel, as enunciated by Bezalel Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and Netanyahu.
Yeah. Yep. I believe Netanyahu just recently, 11 September, said that there will be no Palestine state. He was commenting on a new settlement. Yeah, it was in the news as well. So, but do people in Israel and do people in America don't realize the illegal settlements that are happening every day in Gaza and West Bank? I mean, do they not realize that this is sort of a clear indication that Israel is not desiring peace at this point?
Rational people realize it, Ali, but unfortunately, a lot of people are irrational. Remember, especially in the United States, the Israeli narrative has been messaged, has been gone through the airwaves since 1948. Jews suffered from the Holocaust, the Arab world, you can't trust the Arabs. And then 9/11 happens and ISIS happens. And so all these enemy images of Arabs have pervaded our society. Christian nationalism, Christian nationalists, I consider that ideology to be anti-Semitic, but it's even more Islamophobic. And then, of course, a lot of them, not all, but a lot of the Christian nationalists believe in the second coming. And the rules for the second coming are that the Jews have to get rid of all the non-Jews from the country before Jesus can return. So they don't even care about what's happening. They just care about cleansing the land. They don't care about the suffering of Palestinian people, a lot of them. So I guess, the world is insane. The world is insane.
So I guess different people see it from their own perspectives. Then some people see it as a religious thing. Some people see it as a humanitarian issue, which I think it is a humanitarian issue. It's not a religious issue. It's never been a religious issue when an occupier occupies a group of people.
Yeah, those are all. I consider all those. What's the word? Secondary causes. The number one cause is the mind, the psychospiritual problem that I detailed earlier, the attachment to a presumed limited and mortal identity. You're always going to see through the lens of that identity, and that's going to be how you interpret things, and that's going to be how you form any solutions or any other information about what is happening. You're even going to describe the history that way.
Right. Right.
It's totally illogical. Their thinking is also extremely illogical, but they're confused.
But they haven't. So Israelis, they just haven't killed Palestinians. They have killed Americans also. Americans whose parents are Palestinians. They've killed those as well. I think probably a couple of weeks ago, they killed an American boy who went back to West Bank on a holiday. How do Americans see that or justify that? And I think a couple of days ago, they captured a 13-year-old American boy who was in West Bank on a holiday. IDF captured him saying that he was throwing rocks at them. So he's been taken hostage. And I was reading United Nations report, and it said that there are around 15 to 20,000 hostages, Palestinian hostages in Israel. And for a number of years, women, children, old people, everybody. So do Americans not read that kind of published official literature from United Nations and other reputable organizations? Or is it not, let's say, CNN, MSNBC, CNBC, do they not talk about these issues over there?
As a matter of fact, most Americans don't read, really. But when October 7th happened, I was watching MSNBC every morning. MSNBC is probably the most liberal, the most left-leaning of the mainstream networks. And I would watch that every morning, and it really became a Israeli propaganda source. That's what it became. They would have just regular Israeli citizens from the kibbutz that had been attacked, and they would be talking about how, with all due respect to animals, these Palestinians are animals. And it was so one-sided. And the moderator, like, for example, Joe Scarborough in the morning, who knows nothing, never studied, it's obvious he's never read a book on the subject. He would go off on these 5 or 10 minute diatribes. It was so outrageous. But no, most people, again, people believe what they want to believe. If they hear differing points of view, they will be attracted to the one that fits with how they want to perceive the world. If they want to see me as an enemy, or especially Palestinians, they'll be attracted to dialogue, to narratives that support that desire within them. And of course, look at our government. Joe Biden, Anthony Blinken, and as bad as they were, Donald Trump and Marco Rubio. I mean, I don't know if you've been following these people. They're utterly insane. Now, Biden was even repeating the lies that Israel was propagating about beheaded babies and rapes. And Blinken, when he went to Israel the first time after October 7th, when he went there, he didn't go as the Secretary of State. He didn't go as an American official. He went as, I come as one of you. I'm part of the tribe. That's what he said. And he acted that way. I saw him a couple times say, when I look into the eyes of a Palestinian, I see my children. Right before he gave Israel bunker busting bombs that destroyed all these lives and caused a lot of children to be amputated with no anesthesia.
Yeah.
These people are sick, and they happen to be our leaders, but it's because they're so... Biden's entire career, he always saw himself as a proud Zionist. That was a strong identity for him because he was friends with Jewish donors. But Joe Biden is in all of congressional history, nobody received more money from AIPAC than Joe Biden. And Kamala Harris was number 2. Okay. But so Biden, and Biden's the big schmoozer, he's the big socializer. He's so empathetic, right? No, he's only empathetic within the boundaries of his identity. Outside of his identity, he was completely callous, completely indifferent to the suffering of Palestinians, as was Blinken. They knew that Israel was going to commit genocide. They knew it because Israel said they were going to do it without using that word. But they also knew it because the State Department knows it. In I think it was 1944, the U.S. State Department described the Zionist movement as based on blood and soil, which is the Nazi movement. And then it said, just like the Nazis in Germany. So they've always known this. And now Rubio's even worse. I mean, I don't think he knows anything and cares.
So in the middle of all this, I mean, you've changed your position about Israel and the atrocities. How's your relationship with your family and your friends now in America and in Israel?
With my family, there was a while where we argued about this, where I would argue with my twin brother, who, remember, is Orthodox, and he didn't know anything. He thought he did, but I would refute everything he said with historical information. And then he would always end the conversation with, well, the Torah clearly states that God gave the land to the Jews. End of conversation. Okay, that's it. And that's what probably all the Orthodox believe. But I don't talk about it with them. I don't want to talk about it with my Jewish friends. And I'm not that in touch with them anymore because I live in Colorado and they're back in New Jersey.
Right.
A couple of them are fine. A couple of them recognize what Israel's doing, but some of them are adamant. And here's what's amazing. And again, this is an attribute that is very, very common. In fact, it's universal. My Jewish friends who support Israel have never studied the history. They have never picked up a book, but they cannot admit they never studied the history. They don't think that they know less than me, even though they know that I've written 2 voluminously, meticulously documented books. but it doesn't matter. They cannot admit to themselves. They cannot admit anything to themselves that would possibly implicate them in being wrong. Because if they're wrong, then who are they? Jews are the eternal victims. We have to defend ourselves. Arabs are terrorists. They want to kill Israel. They're Philistines and whatever, Assyrians and Egyptians. They're Israel's mortal, eternal enemies. And that's why I claim that if Israel really, really had its way, and the people who support it, they would kill every Palestinian, because dead Palestinians cannot raid kibbutzim. And look, that's what they're doing. They have no regard for human life. There's over 2,500 soldiers made YouTube videos bragging about killing people, children. I saw some of them.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's puzzling to people like me over here who don't live in Israel or don't live in America. I mean, so that's sort of an evidence. Those images, those videos, those documented cases by United Nations, Amnesty International, they are out there. So it's puzzling that people don't really pay attention to that and just listen to one side of the argument, I guess.
They believe what they want to believe. Again, that's why I say, Ali, that's why I keep impressing on everybody when I talk. It's a psycho-spiritual problem. It's not a problem of logic. Facts are irrelevant. In fact, in the beginning of my second book, Wake Up and Reclaim Your Humanity, I cite a couple studies that were done. I think at Stanford and the University of Michigan. And I think there's hundreds, if not thousands, of similar studies. And what they did was they took people with strongly held opinions, and they showed them irrefutable evidence from mainstream sources that what these people so strongly believed was false. And what occurred was that most of the people, to a very high percentage, became even more entrenched in their wrong opinions than they had been before they were presented with irrefutable evidence that refuted their evidence. Right. That's why, again, it's a psychospiritual, it's emotional.
So when you were writing your book, especially the second book, which won the award, did you do any book tours, or were you invited to any talks or speeches by universities or colleges?
Over the years, since my first book, but over the years I bet you I've probably given 50 talks, and some of them are at colleges, some are local groups, that were formed for peace and justice, things like that. But unfortunately, my point of view, the psychospiritual point of view, is not popular in a world where, especially in the United States, in a hyper-materialistic world, very few people have any interest in anything beneath the surface. So none of the organizations that are active in fighting for Palestinian rights, for equality, Jewish Voice for Peace, J Street, the U.S. Campaign, none of these organizations will even respond to me or anybody else. I'm completely, totally ignored. It's almost as if I've been shunned, because I've been involved for almost 20 years, and not just myself, but many other people have written to me to tell me that they have written and contacted these organizations and said, why don't you invite Richard Ford to your annual convention? Why don't you let him write an article for your blog? It's almost nobody has any interest in a lot of people have interest in what I have to say, but very few people with any influence or parts of organizations are interested. And one of the things is, remember, this is about self-imagery, and people who think they're important. I've been saying this for 20 years. People who think they're important cannot possibly understand what I'm saying, because I'm talking about self-imagery. I'm reducing everybody to a common denominator, to our common humanity. And everything else is in a way, it's an illusion.
Yeah.
As I told you earlier, we are making up our lives as we go along. We are making up the story of our lives. Think of it this way. Maybe we remember 5% of everything that's happened to us since the moment we were born. Well, Who's to say what 5% we're going to remember? What if somehow our minds forgot the 5% we now remember and it was replaced by another 5%? We'd be completely different characters.
Yeah.
We'd have a completely different story. But prior to all of that, prior to the presumption of a limited mortal identity, is our common humanity, is what people might call God. It's the divine condition that is prior to time, that doesn't change, that's absolute, and that is always already the case. It is the ground of everything, out of which everything else is arising. So everything is a modification of that prior condition. And this is what the spiritual teachings are all about, is returning to that recognition, to that condition of unity, you know.
Yep.
But very few people are interested in this, unfortunately.
But the message is still the message of peace. I mean, reducing everybody to a human being is basically the best way to deal with the issue, because it is a humanitarian issue. People can put different spin on it to, comfort themselves or to project their own narrative. But at the end of the day, children who are dying, they are human. Israelis, those who were killed, they were human as well.
Right.
And so I'm not sure if the peace is really possible.
Well, Ali, I always say people would rather be right than make peace.
Yeah.
Okay. So now you're speaking from a rational point of view. You know, someone who is not beholden to one side or the other, someone who isn't out for revenge in one way or another. But, the people who are most involved in this situation, well, most Palestinians I've met, yeah, they want peace. Who wouldn't want peace after what they've been through for the last really more than 100 years? But the Israelis, they want to be right because of their self-imagery. They do not want to be seen as Nazis. How could they possibly be like Nazis? How could Netanyahu be like Hitler? Well, I think they may have surpassed the Nazis.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say that. I mean, that ship's sailed a long time ago now. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, because...
But to them, they can rationalize anything. I'm sure Hitler could rationalize everything that he did.
Yeah.
I'm certain that Netanyahu can.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, they lie to themselves, and then what they tell themselves, they tell you, us. So they lie to themselves first. That's the first step. And then they lie to everybody else.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's the end game now? I mean, I don't think peace is possible now. Gaza is almost destroyed. Illegal settlements are going up every day in West Bank and Gaza. So everything will be occupied. Palestinians will have to move or go somewhere. I mean, where would they go? I mean, or are they going to be killed slowly over the course of 10, 15 years?
Well, it seems that Israel really wants to get rid of the Palestinians out of Gaza. So they're killing them slowly. A lot of them are starving slowly.
Yeah.
But Israel has been negotiating. I don't know where they are in these negotiations, but I know they've been negotiating with Botswana, Rwanda, Somalia, and some other countries to see who will take the Palestinians. Now, of course, I don't know how they'll force the Palestinians. Well, I guess they can force the Palestinians, put them on ships and ship them over there, but they're going to kill an awful lot in the process because there's going to be a lot of resistance to that. Yeah. And so we'll see. I mean, some of the world is now standing up against Israel. Spain and Ireland, I think something like 16 countries have warned Israel not to attack the flotilla that is currently happening. So we'll see what's going to happen with this. I just know that as long as the United States does not take a stand against Israel, it's going to be very hard, very, very hard for there to be any kind of peace at all.
I don't think the United States is going to go against Israel. And but people not realize in the United States that they are just being used as pawns like everybody else? And because at the end of the day, Israel wants what benefits Israel, so they can use other nations, other people as pawns. But do people, and US is the biggest user by Israel, so do people not realize over there?
Most people don't realize it. People in the movement for Palestinian rights realize it, but it's, I mean, since October 7th happened, I'll bet you it's tripled, if not quadrupled in size, but it's still relatively small. Most people don't realize, maybe there's a few Congress people who realize it. Really, Israel dictates foreign policy in the Middle East. The United States goes along. They pretty much do what Netanyahu tells them to do. I mean, what Winston Churchill gave a speech before a combined Congress, House and Senate. And I think Netanyahu is the only other foreign person to give a speech to the full Congress. And he's done it, I don't know, 3 or 4 times, and he gets these dozens of standing ovations for promoting hatred and for promoting ignorance and for promoting Jewish supremacy. And most of these Congress people are not Jewish. I'm sure that Benjamin Netanyahu looks at Donald Trump and Joe Biden and thinks of them as friars. That's the Yiddish word for sucker, because he knows he can manipulate them. Ariel Sharon used to say how easily he could, deal with the American presidents, because they're smarter than the American presidents, and they have the force of their lobby behind them. And not just their lobby, all these Jewish billionaires who, just about all of them, seem to be very staunch supporters of Israel. There's so many of them, the guys who own Google, Bill Ackman, I forget what he owns, but, they just have immense power. Yeah. And it's just so hard to do anything about it.
And they brag about it proudly that they control the media, they control the narrative. I've seen videos on YouTube of Jewish politicians and Jewish rich people bragging about it, which is amazing. That's why I'm amazed people don't see that. It's out there.
It's amazing. Yeah. If you gave a speech and you said Jews control the media, they'd call you an anti-Semite.
Yeah, it's their own words, Yeah. Well, it's fascinating how people justify these kind of things, I guess.
I mean, you can learn a lot about human nature by studying the Israel-Palestine subject. It's very painful, but you can really learn how people can so easily lose their humanity, how in the name of decency and justice, people will act indecently and support injustice. It's just unbelievable. And again, it's so dramatic and exaggerated when it comes to the Israel-Palestine problem. That's why I call it in Israel-Palestine an archetype for suffering.
Yeah, exactly. And I've met people who don't admit that there was such a thing as Palestine, or there were people, Palestinian people. They say there was no such thing as Palestine. It just boggles the mind. Historically, it's been documented since like 3,000 years ago, Palestinians existed. And over generations, how the tribes moved out from the Palestinian region. There are maps going back 400 BC that shows Palestinian region. Yeah.
But even that is a ridiculous argument, because so what? What? Does that give Israel the right to treat people the way that the Palestinians live? Another common argument is, well, do you think Israel has the right to exist?
Yeah.
And my response to that is, well, what if the Knesset changed the name from Israel to anything else, Jewish supremacy land?
Yeah.
Israel would no longer exist. Is that a big problem? Yeah. And then I say, well, what I really believe is that every human being should have a right to live anywhere they want.
Correct.
As long as they do not impinge on the rights of people already living there.
Yeah.
And in that case, no, get rid of the settlers. It's illegal. The International Court of Justice has ruled it illegal. See, this is the thing. The United States has been seduced by Israel, and much of the world has been seduced by Israel, including all of its supporters, into ignoring the fact that Israel is ignoring international law. Now, what is international law good for? There's always going to be disputes between nations and peoples and various factions. So international law was put in place to try to maintain a degree of sanity and humanity in the world so people could live in peace. So what else is there? So Israel has been trying, literally, Israel's goal for most of its existence was to obliterate international law. And when Israel joined the United Nations in 1949, it promised to comply with every UN resolution, past, present, and future. The Fourth Geneva Convention was established after World War II in response to Nazi atrocities. Israel's a signatory to it, and it explicitly prohibits an occupying power from transferring part. This is verbatim. An occupying power cannot transfer parts of its own population into the territories it occupies. And yet the United States has been seduced into ignoring that.
Yeah.
The United States ignores everything. Their laws, if they followed their laws, they wouldn't be able to give Israel any weapons because that's
Yeah.
against the law. They're not allowed to give a country weapons if they use it against people under their control.
Yep. That's true. That's true. So, have you been to Israel? Have you lived in Israel? So,
No, I
how do
haven't
you?
lived there.
Right. So, do they treat Palestinians differently, or do they treat Muslims or Christians differently in Israel?
Well,
Or
first of all, the first time I was in Israel was in 2010. And so that was, the separation wall had been in process of being built for many years at that point.
right,
And of course, the separation wall makes it less likely that Jews will encounter non-Jews.
right,
And what that does is, if Jews don't see Palestinians, then they're only going to see the images in their mind that they conjure out of what
yep,
they hear from their leaders.
yep,
So if they saw, like when I was in the West Bank and Gaza, I would sometimes go out walking at night by myself. And sometimes I would get lost and I would ask a Palestinian help. And they were all, nice to me. And then I would tell them I was Jewish. And they would also, practically every Palestinian said to me, well, Judaism is not the problem. Zionism is the problem. I mean, Palestinians are far more educated than Americans and probably Israelis. In fact, I think they are. And of course, they kind of have to be given their circumstances.
yeah,
But I do know that, for example, Dehesha refugee camp outside of Bethlehem, a higher percentage of the kids go on from high school to college than the Jewish kids who live in Jerusalem. But anyway, I mean, so I've been there, but the separation wall makes it exacerbates the problem because it gives Israelis a greater sense that they have to be separated, and because they don't get to meet Palestinians, all they know is what their leaders tell them. They're bloodthirsty savages. On the other hand, the Palestinians, since they can't go anywhere, the ones who can't, of course, there's the Palestinians who live in the holy city, in East Jerusalem, and they mingle with Jews. But most Palestinians, the only Jews they see are soldiers breaking down their walls or settlers attacking them, poisoning their wells, cutting down their olive trees, poisoning their crops, beating them up, stealing their houses with the army beside them. One time I did an interview. It was a radio interview, and the interviewer was a Palestinian who lives in the United States. And during the interview, he had a journalist on the interview from Jordan, a very nice woman. And so when we finished the interview, she wanted to ask some questions. And the first thing she told me was, I've never met a Jewish person like you. All the Jews I've ever encountered were soldiers or people who hated me. And I didn't know there were Jewish people like you. And what happened was she actually said, I realize now I can't hate all Jews.
yep,
I can't be a Jew
yep,
hater because I realize not all Jews are like you. Only some Jews are like you.
yep,
So that, and yet all these people who support Israel will call me an anti-Semite, even though I have done way more in deflecting anti-Semitism, and everything they do increases anti-Semitism. As I always say, anti-Semites incite anti-Semitism, and nobody does that more effectively and more frequently than Israel and its supporters.
yeah. I mean, I agree with you. And there's a book by Norman Finkelstein, The Holocaust Industry. It talks
Right.
about the same thing as well. Do you think the term anti-Semitism has been diluted now because it's been used so broadly, and the definition has changed because the place where I come from, anti-Semitism means completely different. I mean, we go back to the roots, who were the Semites, Abrahamic
Right.
people, stuff like that. But over the years, people have hijacked some of the terms and are using it for their own benefit. So, does the term really have any significance now?
You know, in the United States, the Congress passed the definition of anti-Semitism, which pretty much makes it anti-Semitic to
Hmm.
criticize Israel. So basically, what they have done now, I want to mention that even before 1948, Abba Eban, who was a famous political theorist, and he was eventually, I believe, foreign minister to the United States and beloved by the Jewish community in the United States, a very eloquent spokesperson. He was very dovish, and he often criticized Israel for its brutal tactics against Palestinians. But he made the point, even before Israel became a state, and he was one of the founding fathers, but he made the point that henceforward, criticism of Zionism should be equated with anti-Semitism. So they wanted to make it seem like, well, they wanted to basically insulate Israel from any criticism whatsoever. And one of the main arguments is the Holocaust. Oh, the world turned its head away from the Holocaust. We were slaughtered, so we can do anything we want. And that's pretty much so in the United States. I think over 30 states in the United States have passed laws that businesses cannot transact business with the state if they have ever condoned the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. That's a violation
Yeah.
of their free speech rights.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So
but Israel has its tentacles in every aspect of American society: Hollywood, finance, Congress, high tech. There are over nine. I read there were over 900 former intelligence officers from Israel who now work in the United States for Google. Intel now calls itself as much an Israeli company as an American company.
mm.
So Israel just has its tentacles everywhere. It's just poisoned our culture to such an enormous extent.
And in some ways, it's very detriment to the Jewish people also, because the world
Yes,
starts equating all these atrocities with what the Jews are doing in Israel.
right,
Some Jews are doing in Israel to Palestinian, as you know. This is
right.
probably what Jews do. So that sort of propagates that bad image of Jews as well, which is not right. Well, I've learned so much from this talk, really. I just wanted to get a different perspective for someone who's lived in America and been to Israel. I wanted to understand how those people think, and so we still don't know what's going to happen in future. But realistically, I don't know what peace would look like. I'm not sure. No one can answer at this point because one side has all the power, the other side doesn't really have any power. So not sure what's going to happen, but I hope things settle down soon. Uh, I'm not sure what people in America think or what's going to happen, but as long as arms are going to Israel, resources are going to Israel to commit all these atrocities, I don't think it can stop on its own.
I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a higher percentage of Americans today are critical of Israel than they were, 2 years ago, and around the world. I mean, Israel is really creating an awful lot of bad blood, especially in the Arab world. But even all around the world, people are seeing these atrocities. It's just so sane people are see how horrific this is.
Yeah. I mean, one way of thinking is, did America had any enemies before 1948 in Middle East? I can't recall. I mean, most of the enemies
Right.
were created after 1940s, 50s, 60s, I guess.
I
When
think the Arab world looked very kindly upon the United States until
yes,
maybe George W. Bush invaded Iraq.
yeah, and the reason was because of the British colonialism. They wanted another power to come in, and they saw America as a democratic country and peace-loving country in those days. But I think that narrative has shifted. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, Richard. I really appreciate you taking the time to
Thank
talk
you,
to
Ali.
me,
I appreciate you having me.
and I hope you have a great day.